Hello student, in this video we will see section B from 16 number question. Let's see. The question is, in brief state what happens when the Golgi aperture is removed from the cell. So attaining this answer we must know the function of Golgi aperture. Then and then we can write down the importance of it. If in the cell Golgi aperture is not there, then what happened? That things we have to write down. Let's see the answer. So the Golgi apertures has the main function of modifying, shortening and the packaging the proteins which is synthesized by the cell. As we know that Golgi aperture's main function is to whatever the protein which is synthesized by the cell, that all the proteins modify, shortening and the packaging, that things is done by the Golgi apertures. So the Golgi body are also involved in the transport of lipid molecule across the cell. The shortening, modifying and packaging work of protein. Along with that, it is also help to transport of lipid. And the cellular secretion are also packed in a vesicle form by the lysosome, and the transported it is whatever the packed food that is transferred out from the cell, and the Golgi apertures form the part of the cellular endomembrane system. Means it possesses the protein coming from the endoplasmic reticulum, means ER. So this kind of function which is performed by the Golgi apertures. But our question is, if it is not there, then what happened? Then the protein synthesis, modifying, shortening and the packaging will not occur, and the transportation of lipid molecule across the cell will stop. So this is the answer we can write down in the 16 number question. Let's see the next question. Question number 17. Differentiate between meristematic and permanent tissue in the plant. We have to write down the difference between meristematic and the permanent tissue in the plant. As we know that the meristematic tissue, that is continuously divide kind of tissue, and the permanent tissue who cannot further divide. After the divide, it is converted into the permanent tissue. So let's see in the brief answer about the difference between the meristematic and the permanent tissue in the plant. Let's see. Meristematic tissue. As I told you that meristematic tissue that is continuously dividing cell, the permanent tissue that do not divide continuously. Meristematic tissue, the cells are the small and the isodiametric. Isodiametric means we can say that it is a same in shape. Whereas in permanent tissue, it is a variable in the shape and the size. Meristematic tissue, that cell wall is thin, and in permanent tissue, the cell wall is thick. Whereas in meristematic tissue, the nuclei are very large. Whether in permanent tissue, it is a small in size. In meristematic tissue, the vacuoles are absent, whereas in permanent tissue, the vacuoles are present. And in meristematic tissue, the intracellular space is absent, means the cells, all the cells are closely packed to each other. But in the permanent tissue, the intramolecular space is present. Intracellular space is present. Whereas in meristematic tissue, the metabolic activity are at a high rate. Means whatever the metabolic activity which is carried out by the cell, that is a high that performing at a high rate. Whereas in permanent tissue, it occur in a low rate. The meristematic tissue, in that the inorganic inclusion is absent, whereas in permanent tissue, that is present. And in mesosomatic tissue, the cells are undifferentiate, means it is continuously dividing cell. After the dividing as well, it is not differentiate. So we can say that cells are undifferentiate. Whereas the permanent tissue, there the cells are differentiated. Then as we know that the mesosomatic tissue that comes under to a simple tissue, whereas the permanent tissue, it is whether a simple as well as a complex as well. So this is the basic difference between the meristematic tissue and permanent tissue. Let's see one more time. Meristematic tissue, it's a continuously dividing cell, whereas a permanent tissue that do not divide continuously. The meristematic tissue cells are small and the isodiametric, whereas a permanent tissue are variable in shape and size. The meristematic tissue, its cell wall is thin, whereas the cell wall is thick. In meristematic tissue, the nuclei are large, whereas in permanent tissue, the nuclei are small. The meristematic tissue, the vacuoles are absent, whereas in permanent tissue, the vacuoles are present. In meristematic tissue, the intracellular space is absent, whereas in permanent tissue, it is present. And metabolic activity rate is high, whereas in permanent tissue is low. And inorganic inclusion is absent, whereas in permanent tissue it is present. And the cells are undifferentiated, whether in permanent tissue all the cells are differentiated. And it is a simple kind of tissue, whereas a permanent tissue is a simple or complex one. Let's see the next question. If this kind of difference asked in 2 marks, then you have to write down minimum 4 points. Then you can easily get the 2 marks. Let's see the question of 17 number. Name any 2 simple and 2 complex permanent tissue in the plant. So if we are talking about the simple permanent tissue, then the simple permanent tissue, that is a parenchyma, collenchyma, sclerenchyma, that comes under to a simple tissue. Whereas in a complex permanent tissue, there is 2 type of complex permanent tissue in the plant, that is xylem and the phloem. As we know that the xylem, which is responsible for the transportation of water, whereas a phloem, which is responsible for the transportation of food particles. Let's see the next. So the answer is for simple permanent tissue, you can write down the parenchymal and the collenchyma. And for the complex permanent tissue, it is a xylem and phloem. Let's see the next question. Question number 18. Write down the difference between distance and displacement. We have to write down the difference between the distance and displacement. As we know that the distance means a total path which is covered by the body, that all comes under to a distance. But in a displacement, we only have to consider the starting point and the ending point. And whether it is scalar or vector, that also we have to write down in the difference of distance and displacement. Let's see in detail. So the difference between distance and displacement, as I told you, that distance means the length of the path between 2 points is called the distance between those points. Whereas in displacement, the displacement means the shortest pathway or shortest distance between the 2 points, which has magnitude and as well as the direction. Displacement means a shortest pathway, or you can say the shortest distance which is covered by the body of that 2 points, which has a magnitude and the direction. So that consider as a displacement. As we know that for the describing of the distance, there is no any requirement for the direction. So the distance is known as a scalar quantity, whereas a displacement is a vector quantity. Because for the describing of the displacement, the direction is important. That's why it is called the vector quantity. So the distance is scalar quantity and the displacement is a vector quantity. The distance which is represented by the capital S, whereas for the displacement which is represented by the d, small d. The distance can be calculated by the formula S is equal to V into T, whereas the displacement can be calculated by the formula D is equal to V into T. The SI unit of distance is meter and the SI unit of displacement is also meter. In additionally, you can write down the example by the drawing a pathway. In that you can describe that A, B, C point, and you can say that in a 10-minute the bus is go from A to B, then after B to C, and then again come back to B. Then the total distance is traveled by 2. By that total pathway we have to count down and write down. But in displacement we have to just count the path between the A and B. So that example also you can write down. Let's see one more time. Distance means the length of the path between the 2 points is called the distance between those points. And the displacement means the shortest pathway. And it is magnitude, having a magnitude and the direction. And distance is a scalar quantity as it does not require any kind of direction for the explanation. And for displacement, it is vector quantity because uh, we require direction for the explain it. And the distance is represented by the capital S, whereas displacement is represented by the small d. The distance can be calculated by the formula S is equal to V2, and the displacement can be calculated by formula D is equal to Vt. The SI unit of distance is a meter and the SI unit of displacement is also meter. Let's move further. Question number 18. Explain the inertia. Here we have to write down the definition of inertia as well as how it is important. That we also have to write down along with the example. Let's see answer in detail. So the inertia is the property of matter that causes it to resist the change in the velocity. That means the body they have that have a tendency to retain their original state, that called the inertia. Inertia, it is a one kind of property of matter that causes it to resist a change in the velocity, means the speed and the direction. It's try to retain their original state. So, according to Newton's first law of motion, an object with a given velocity maintain their velocity unless the acted on by an external force. So, the inertia is the property of matter that makes this law hold true. The amount of inertia of an object is possessed is proportional to its mass. However, the inertia is not the same thing as the mass or momentum. Means if the mass is increased, then the inertia of the object is also increased, and it is also directly proportional to the speed, or you can say the momentum. If the momentum of the object is more, then the inertia, you can say that the inertia is not the same thing as the mass or momentum. Means the product of the velocity and the mass. The mass of an object can be measured by the observing of the extent of its inertia, but this is done by the measuring the total amount of the force that we require to produce a certain acceleration. Means you can write down the definition. Means the inertia means it is a property of matter that causes it to resist the change in velocity, and the any object would try to retain their original state. The tendency to retain their original state, it is known as inertia, and the inertia is directly proportional to the mass. If the mass is more, then the inertia of an object is also more. And you can also write down the example that for the moving 15 kg luggage require more force. means the inertia, it has a more inertia. Same like if the mass of the luggage is 5 kg, then it require a less force. That means the inertia of that 5 kg luggage is less than the 10 kg luggage. So you can write down the example and the explain the inertia. You can connect it with the Newton's first law. In next video we will see the section C. Thank you.